Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes. This week, a tale of a charming villain motivated by money and ego to murder. I'm very pleased to introduce Gordon Lowe. He was a solicitor in London for 10 years and owned his own law practice after that until his retirement, when he began writing full-time. He's written multiple true crime nonfiction books, including, of course, the one he's here to talk about. It is called The Acid Bath Murders, The Trials and Liquidations of John George Haigh. Thank you so much for coming on. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure, Eric. Thank you very much for having me.
Certainly. So what is it about this case that first intrigued you? What made you want to write a book about it?
Well, I think it's an odd life, actually, as a true life crime author, in finding subjects that haven't been much written about. Because, of course, a lot of the very famous true crimers, and I'm sure this is the same in the States as it is here, have usually been written about. And publishers are not so keen for that unless it's a completely new angle. So you have to be a little bit careful and try to find a subject that, A, interests you. And John Haigh certainly did that as a multiple murderer, serial murderer. But there hadn't been a lot written about him. And this is one reason why I chose him, a good subject without a vast library of books about him. And so I thought he was my man.
Right, yeah. So this story is set in post-World War II Great Britain. Would you set the scene for us? What was life like for the average Brit in the late 1940s?
Very much post-war Britain. Not much money around. Most of this was set in London or nearby, so a lot of bomb sites still, business still not back on its feet. People on the whole not well off, unless there was some family money stored up, which probably applies to our first few victims, actually, of Hague. So a big gap between the poor, who were struggling after the war, had often been involved in fighting for the war, for the army or whatever, and the moneyed classes, who were pretty well safe and cared for, and which led us, of course, to our first scene that I think we're going to discuss for Olive Durand-Deacon in a rather well-off hotel, which in effect was a care home for the rich. So I think that's where we started. But London life trying to struggle back to its feet and put itself back in the picture after a devastating war.
So your book opens with the tragic story of Olive Durand-Deacon. Would you tell us about her and how she found herself in such unfortunate circumstances?
Certainly. An interesting character. Olive was about 60 years old. She was a widow. Her husband had been quite a war figure. He'd received the British Military Cross, one of the highest awards for bravery. He died, and so at the age of 60, she was on her own, heading towards her dotage, as it were, and as a care home, what we probably call a care home these days, she'd found the Onslow Court Hotel, which is in a very well-to-do area of London in Queen's Gate in South Kensington. Many of your listeners will know it, quite near, for example, the Science Museum and the Natural History Museum in central London. And installed herself there. It was not a cheap hotel. She had one of the best rooms on the first floor. And the other thing, which we'll return to in a moment, but most of the other residents were another 20 years older. Many were in their 80s. For that reason, it was for the elderly, really, to see out the rest of their lives in some comfort, which made John Haigh something of an exception because he was only 40 years old. So a comfortable hotel, it's still there, incidentally, if anyone wants to pop in there. It's now known as the Kensington Hotel. And this is where both she and Haigh met as fellow customers of the hotel.
And she had a very interesting life herself. She had been involved in her younger years in the suffragette movement. And even at age 69, she was still trying things. She belonged to organizations. She had interesting business ideas, right?
Very much so. She was a bright woman. As you say, she'd been involved in the British suffragette movement quite violently too. And in fact, on one occasion, she threw a brick through a window and was arrested and spent a few hours in a cell. That's not in any way to suggest she was a criminal, because she wasn't. But this is what she'd come from, a political and a privileged background, but no layabout at all. She was using her time to go to classes, to read, to go to concerts. She was only down the road from the Royal Albert Hall, which she'd visit frequently. So it was set up to have an active but productive life in her retirement. And in fact, this was one of the things that engaged her with Haigh from the very start. She had this idea that she had a bit of a talent for being a businesswoman. And in those post-war years, buying fashionable clothes or products was not easy. In fact, it was very, very difficult for obvious reasons. And so she had this idea of possibly making plastic fingernails. She'd already had a few. She had a box full of them up in her room. And she thought, well, possibly I could manufacture these with the help. And John Haigh seemed perfect because no one knew exactly what he did, but he seemed to be some light civil engineer. And he'd said a few times in the hotel that he had a rather nice factory down in a place called Crawley, which is now near Gatwick Airport. And she said, well, look, John, you're an inventor, you're an engineer, you're a bright man. What about manufacturing these and perhaps finding a little market for them? John found this rather interesting for very different reasons, because he saw here as possibly someone who was a little naive and a little innocent, who was extremely well off, and who might, as it were, be added to his portfolio of victims.
So Haigh was living at this hotel. He was getting along with the women living there alongside him. And he was someone who enjoyed the finer things in life, right? But he didn't have the financial wherewithal to pay for his expensive tastes.
John Haigh was, in fact, broke. He lived, as you point out, the good life. He had smart suits cut in Savile Row in London, the most expensive place you could have a suit made for you. He had a nice car, an old Alvis, an old British Alvis car, no longer made. He had regular haircuts down in Victoria, expensive shoes, and appeared to go out to the best places. He would go up to concerts at the Albert Hall. He would do this and he would do that. The truth was he was in debt, and he owed money to his business partner. He owed money he had gambling debts. He owed money to the bank. And he was also owing 2 months' rent to the hotel itself, which wasn't cheap. And in fact, staff, or the cashier from the hotel, was starting at last to come up to his room, knock on the door and say, Mr. Haigh, this can't go on. You now owe 2 months' rent. When you're going to pay up? To which he said, oh, no problem, just give me a week or two. Well, of course, it was a problem because he had no money. and he couldn't move because he wouldn't be able to put a deposit down anywhere or go to another hotel. So he was stuck. So he had to think how he was going to make some money. And the way he thought of doing this was to cash in on people like Mrs. Durand-Deacon, whom he knew was well off. She wore lovely jewellery, which she wore day and night. She had the most beautiful coat, Persian lamb coat. And in fact, what he did then was to suggest to her and endorse her idea of making these wretched plastic nails. And he said, look, the way we do this is, Olive, you must come down to the factory, as he called it, in Crawley, meet my business partner, have a look at a few prototypes that we might use for you. And one Friday morning, as he's having breakfast opposite her, he says, today's the day, Olive, I'm going to take you down there. We'll have some lunch, we'll have a look around the area, but I will show you my workshop and I'll show you the prototypes that we've got. So he bundles her into the car. They drive down to Crawley, say an hour and a half or so. They use the hotel in the high street at Crawley to use the bathroom there, and then he takes her round the corner to the factory. Well, the factory turns out to be not exactly a factory. It is an earthenware workshop, which is musty, it's damp, it's ill-lit, it smells, it's got a rough work table with a few towels lying around, a few shreds of flex wire hanging from the walls. And of course, poor Olive is slightly surprised by it. It doesn't quite live up to the image that John has been producing. And he then takes Olive over to the work table and says, well, look, here are, these are the prototypes I'm thinking about. He produces 2 plastic red sheets, which frankly could have come and be used for anything, and says, look, have a look at these, see if you like the colour and the quality, and we'll take it from there. And as Olive bends over the work table, he reaches into a hat box, which has been sitting on the floor, produces a revolver unseen to her, and shoots Olive in the back of the head.
Yeah, and that kills her instantly, correct?
That kills her instantly. She's 14 stone. She's a large lady. She slumps onto the work face and then onto the floor. The first thing John does is take all her jewellery off her. He knows exactly what he's doing. Rings, crucifix brooch around her neck, and puts that to one side. So that, if you like, is safe for the moment, at least with John. He then has to think quickly about how he's going to handle all this. Now, he's already told his business partner the other side of town that he's bringing a prospective customer down to look at these plastic sheets. He then, leaving Olive, of course, there in the workshop, he drives over to the other side of town to tell his business partner she never turned up. He goes back to the workshop and then starts the arduous work of bundling Olive's body into a drum, if you like, the shape of an old oil drum that is bought specifically for this purpose. He trusses her up like a turkey for Thanksgiving or for Christmas, and he spends 2 hours in this operation. It is arduous. It takes all his strength. He's only a small man, but manages to get the body into the oil drum. He's exhausted at the end of that. He manages to get the oil drum up on its end, on the floor. And at this stage, and this is a mark of the sort of man we're up against, he pops out of the workshop into the high street, into the local cafe for a cup of tea and a fried egg on toast. And we know which cafe it was, and we know the owner said, "Oh, well, John Haigh, he knows a bit, John's come in for tea." He said, "Oh, he's in a good mood that day. We had a good chat about him getting back to London and business generally." And halfway through this, of course, he doesn't tell the proprietor, but John realizes that he hasn't actually locked the door to the workshop. So the first time he sort of lost his cool about this, he quickly finishes his tea and beetles back to the workshop to find, in fact, he hadn't locked it. But fortunately, there's none of his workmates or any other tenants are in the yard. No one has been in there, and he's safe. Anyway, so he goes into the workshop, locks the door this time, and then in a macabre scene, which is something out of a Hitchcock movie, if you think about it, he then dons industrial gloves, long sleeve industrial gloves, a rubber apron, rubber boots, and a gas mask, because he's now going to come into close contact with sulphuric acid. He has 3 industrial containers, carboys as they were known, of industrial sulphuric acid, which he's brought in before, and he siphons these using a crude stirrup pump to pump the acid into the drum in which poor Mrs. Durand-Deacon is trussed up. It's quite a dangerous operation, actually, as you can imagine, with sulphuric acid, but he manages to do it, top up the drum, and that, for the moment, is all he's going to do. He knows that after about 24 to 48 hours that a body will dissolve in sulphuric acid to pretty well nothing, but it takes time. So he this time takes off his kit, he locks the door and drives off back to London. But the gall of the man, he manages to stop off in the high street again, and this time he doesn't visit the cafe, he goes into that hotel he first visited a few hours ago with Mrs. Durand-Deacon, and has a rather nice dinner there. Orders himself chicken and a bottle of wine. Again, apparently, according to the staff, he's cheerful, optimistic, passes the time of the evening with them, and then drives back to London.
Wow. So he also now has a number of items that he is eager to exchange for cash. So he starts making the rounds, trying to pawn off Mrs. Durand-Deacon's belongings.
That's exactly it. He's got a couple of days of comparative rest. He pops back to the workshop every day to see how she is stewing. If I don't want to elaborate on these rather unpleasant circumstances, but he has to go back to see how she's cooking and whether, the gruel is thinning, as it were. The other thing he does, yes, is go off to a jeweller's that he's used before, a Mr. Buller, and manages straight away to sell Durand-Deacon's watch for 10 quid and then the rest of the jewellery to him. So that's set him up with a little cash. And he also decides to have her Persian lamb coat cleaned. There's no blood on it, but it did drop on the floor. She dropped to the floor herself, poor lady. But he simply wants it cleaned and looking as best as possible, knowing that he's going to try to sell it. So that goes into the cleaners. That's going to take a day or two to come back. The other thing he's got to do is to try to comfort everyone at the hotel, because, of course, Mrs. Durand-Deacon has just disappeared. He can manage it for a few hours by saying, oh, she's probably gone off to relatives. But you see, she wasn't that sort of person. She was a very particular person. She had a good friend at the hotel, Mrs. Constance Lane, in her 80s. And Mrs. Lane was getting more and more worried. And in the end, they asked one of the hotel maids to unlock Olive's door, number 115 in the hotel. And they find that she hasn't spent a night there. Her nightdress is still out and the bed turned down. So something has to be done. And Hague, thinking on his feet as usual, is trying to ingratiate himself with Mrs. Leigh because there's going to be trouble there otherwise. So he says, Constance, this is extremely worrying. You're going to report this to the police, quite right, but I insist on taking you myself. We'll go up to Chelsea police station. I shall drive you up and make sure that we manage to see the police. So with this sort of gall, that's exactly what he does. But this is the start of Hague's downfall, really. He's overplaying it. And really, if he hadn't done that, probably things would have been a little easier for him, because he makes Sergeant Maud Lambourne there in the station a bit suspicious. What is this rather smart, urbane man doing here in his fancy suits and his lovely haircut? A man of 40 years age with an 80-year-old, living apparently in a hotel that is virtually a care home. So Sergeant Lambourne does two things. She asks her colleague to check if this man Hague has any criminal record. And she then goes up to the hotel herself just to have a look around. And everything is confirmed that she feared. This is a home for the elderly. Hague is quite out of place. There's something very odd going on here. And when she gets back to the police station, her colleague gives her Hague's criminal record, which is fairly extensive. He's committed various crimes of fraud. He's been in prison at least once. And even that was rather intriguing. He was in prison for pretending or putting himself up as a solicitor, as an attorney. And he was dealing with the estates of deceased estates and selling off at a bargain price probate shares from the estates. And he said he couldn't make money fast enough. He said he couldn't get to the bank fast enough. It was all working so perfectly. But the only slip Hague had made was on the notepaper of these supposed solicitors to spell the name of the city wrong. It was Guildford, which is a rather beautiful city in southern England. But he'd left the D out of Guildford. It's a slip we can all make if we don't know the city. And that, of course, made clients suspicious. Well, what is this supposedly well-educated solicitor doing, misspelling the name of his own city? So the police at that stage move in and find he's acting as a fraud, and he goes to prison. But it's while he's sitting in prison with that rather overworked mind of his that it comes to him that if he's going to really make any money, it's going to have to be big time. And if you're going to murder anyone, you've got to get rid of a body. And what about putting them in acid and dissolving them? So he asks people, fellow prisoners going out into the fields to work, to bring him back dead mice or whatever they can find, a few birds. And he experiments with sulphuric acid from the prison workshop. And to his delight, it works. He knows he can do it. And this is really the start of the whole idea. And so when he comes to Durand-Deacon and any other victim, he knows exactly where he stands, still slightly getting the law wrong, because he feels at this stage that if there is no body found after committing a murder, then he is safe from prosecution. He'd got that wrong. In fact, the courts, of course, had been faced with this problem before and had decided in case law, British courts decided, as they have obviously in America, that even if you have a body, using circumstantial evidence that points towards a murder, then that can be relied on. You don't actually need the body to be produced. Of course, it helps because a prosecution is very much more likely to get a conviction with a body, but it's not 100% essential.
Right, right. So he's in financial trouble. But once he's got this cash, he flourishes it, right? He flippantly tosses his rent money on the bed.
Yes, he never quite knows where to limit himself, Hague. I think he's so relieved to have sold this jewellery for whatever it was. He certainly had £50 in cash. That he goes back to the hotel, and the next time the cashier comes up, he said, "Oh, absolutely no problem." I think Mrs. Kirkdale was her name. There it is on the bed, 50 quid, £50. Take what you want, rather grand. So in fact, she not only takes the rent he owes, but she's going to take the next 2 months too, and he doesn't like that idea very much. He said, "No, take cash for what I owe you, but a cheque will do, won't it, for the next 2 months?" She says, "No, it certainly will not. We've had enough of all this." So she just goes on counting and takes all the money. But it certainly puts him back in heart, and still gives him a bit of surplus cash that I think he hasn't produced. And his girlfriend at the time, Barbara Stevens, we haven't mentioned her, but a lovely girl, half his age again, about 20 years old, noticed that he's suddenly become much more optimistic. He's treating her to tea, afternoon tea down in the restaurant. He's saying, "Have what you want, we must start going out again." There's a huge change has gone on, and life is suddenly looking up again for Hague.
Right. So again, he goes to the police station. It's his idea. He wants to personally report her disappearance. Other murderers have made this mistake in history, believing that going to the police makes them less suspicious. And of course, it often has the opposite effect.
Absolutely. Rather a naive approach, because, of course, Hague wouldn't see himself as looking suspicious. They would see, he would see other people seeing him, as most did, as debonair, bright, a joker, apparently well off because he turns up in a lovely car. But he accelerates the whole process by not only letting them see him and the background, but of course allowing the police to go back up to the hotel just to see what's going on up there. And the thing doesn't look right. And a lot of this case, the Durand-Deacon case, is thanks to Sergeant Lambourne in those early days, which I imagine female police officers were very much the minority then, clocking this and getting the matter sorted. And it led to the arrest. They came up, they interrogated or asked Hague a lot of questions. And at first he resisted it all and said no, he was being blackmailed and what have you. But at last he confessed. He'd had enough. And I think it shows Hague's sloppiness, actually, with this victim, that he is losing his touch. Anyway, he confesses to this. The police, of course, are rather pleased. A few more slips start now. He's becoming careless, and as the chief examining policeman is out of the room for a moment, taking an urgent call, he turns to the other police officer and says, "Look, if I ended up in Broadmoor, which was is the leading criminal asylum, lunatic asylum, mental asylum, what do you think? How did they let you out in the end?" And I think the police officer said, "Oh, possibly, 6 years or so, you'll be there and you may be out." And Hague leaves it as that. But the police officer quite rightly then tells his colleague, who then comes back. And of course, what's happening is that he's going into plan B, really. Yes, admit it. Make yourself sound as mad as possible, insane as possible, and possibly have 6 years in Broadmoor, which is no fun itself, a large Victorian mental asylum down in Surrey, England. And but that could be a lot worse. Anyway, they struggle on through this, and this is a few hours questioning, as you can imagine. By the evening, they're tired. They've had a few cups of tea and someone's brought in a hamburger or whatever they had to bring in those days, a sandwich probably. And he says, just casually as they're thinking about getting home, getting some decent rest, he said, oh, by the way, there were others. And they say, well, what's that, John? What do you mean? He said, well, I have dealt with other people in the same way that I've dealt with Olive Durand-Deacon. So the notebooks come out again. And he then admits to murdering at least 3 other people, which is Donald McSwan, his first employer, and Donald's 2 parents. And what seems to have happened, they of course said, well, how have you done that? And he simply said, oh, in the same way. The only difference is that John Haigh was then operating completely from central London. And he had a basement, another pretty dreadful basement, like his workshop now, in the Gloucester Road in central London, hidden away, whereby he could operate the same system, shoot or beat the victim over the head. He didn't have a revolver in those earlier days. This was about 2 or 3 years before Olive's demise. Beat them over the head, kill them that way, and dissolve them in sulphuric acid. The one big difference was that in the middle of this basement, as luck would have it, was a large grating and a drain. So what he did, instead of having to chuck remains out in a yard, he could pour his victims in a form of sludge soup straight down the drain. The drain fed into the River Thames and was lost straight away, was washed away in the Thames. And that was completely foolproof. Even if any remains had remained in the sludge, no one would have spotted it in that huge river. And so for those 3 victims, he had committed the perfect murders. And the plan was that he'd pick 3 victims who were well off. A bit sad, really, because the first victim was a very good friend of his. He lived with him up the road at Queensgate. This man had given him a job, Donald, in an amusement arcade. But John Haigh knew that Donald had 2 or 3 properties. He was well off. And so having got rid of the body, he started to forge documents over into of the various properties owned by McSwan into his own name. Did it very successfully. There were shares and what have you. And he then turned his eye to Donald's parents, who were also living in London, elderly. They were even easier to deal with. But knowing them as he did, he knew exactly how much they were worth, where their assets were, and what he would have to do to forge the transfers, a bit as he was doing in that Guildford scenario with those probate shares. So he had good forgery skills, which on this occasion bore fruit.
So in volunteering this information about prior murders, was his goal to convince the police that adding more murders to his resume might make him appear more insane?
Exactly. He confessed to another 2. And these were a very respectable couple, Dr. and Mrs. Henderson, who had a lovely house in Ladbroke Square in central London, 22 Ladbroke Square. And he'd got to know them because they were selling the house. So this, is pre-Olive and post the McSwans. And so he'd gone round there posing as an interested purchaser. And they were asking, in just about 1946, 47, £7,500, which actually in those days for a London house was, quite a lot of money. So Hague rolls into the house. He says, "Oh, this is nice." He said, "This house, is worth far more than £7,500. I'm going to offer you £10,500. And they sort of looked at him as if they'd actually heard right. Again, classic Hague, overcooking the whole thing. And Mrs. Henderson's brother, on hearing this, said, if you meet a man like that, your best thing to do is run for it. And of course, he was quite right. He had no idea that, this was just a sort of fraud and leading to the most terrible things. But anyway, Hague never became quite close friends with them. Of course, he never went on about he never continued with the house, but they became good social friends and they knew each other. They had parties together. He played the piano for them, which he was quite talented at. And so the whole thing went from there. And I'm afraid the two Hendersons got the same treatment. But this time, Hague had moved to the Crawley workshop, the same one as for Olive, Durand-Deacon, and he disposed of them there. He didn't even have to find a gun because Dr. Henderson, who'd fought in the war, Second World War, had an old service revolver, and Hague stole this to eventually shoot Dr. Henderson and his wife the same day in separate occasions, and deal with them exactly the same way. Dissolve them in sulphuric acid and tip them out in the yard outside the workshop.
Wow. So the police have been investigating this case, of course. They're tracing his steps as he sold these various items, and they confront him with these receipts, this evidence.
I think by this stage, Hague, having been in this questioning where he confessed 1, 2, 3, 4, so many murders, he was confessing anything. And while the evidence was helpful, particularly as they hadn't got a body, then the jewellery turning up, the jeweller was Mr. Buller, who'd bought the jewellery, unsuspecting, and was reading his Sunday newspaper. And of course, this was all over the front pages, but they'd taken photographs of the missing jewellery, and he said, "Oh my God, I've got all this jewellery. It's in my safe." So he got to the police pretty quickly. The police got into the workshop without too much of a delay. Even then, it was not easy because they only knew about the main factory in Crawley and the business, the legit business. But once they started talking to Edward Jones, the business partner, Edward mentioned this workshop over the other side of town. They said, "Well, we haven't heard of that before," in Leopold Road. So they jumped into the car and raced over, broke their way into it. And at that stage, they found a receipt for the cleaning receipt for the coat. They found the revolver. They found splashes of blood on the wall beyond the desk on which Olive had collapsed after being shot. So that by this stage, they had all the evidence they wanted. And of course, they could put that as well to Hague, who wasn't denying it. The next stage, really, was to try to get some slightly better evidence of the victims themselves. And they brought down a pathologist who painstakingly looked at what was going on here and had the idea of going out into the yard just to see what he could find and removed great boxes of earth from the yard, went through it meticulously. This was, I won't say unusual, but this, in these early days of forensic science, he took enormous care of what he was doing. And he found some obvious things and some less obvious things. Obviously, was Mrs. Durand-Deacon's red plastic handbag. That had not dissolved. Again, this was Hague now being really careless. They found a bone, a human bone, which actually in the end turned out to be one of Dr. Henderson's feet, nothing to do with Olive. But he also found a couple of minute pea-sized gallstones in all those boxes of earth. And because of his training and because this man was really very expert, he recognized these minute pieces of whatever as human gallstones. And again, the net closed even tighter on this. This was the pathologist, Dr. Keith Simpson. This was really one of his early, very famous cases, and it went on to have a very distinguished career as a forensic pathologist. One of the police found a penknife in Hague's car with bloodstains on it. This is something I've never quite understood. I think it was a yellow penknife. And with Hague saying that, trying to sound mad and saying, I slit my victim's throat and took blood from their neck, which I drank, trying to sound insane. Confronted with the penknife, he said, oh, no, that was nothing to do with it. I mean, he didn't suggest why there was blood on the penknife. But anyway, there it is. It was a little bit of a contradiction. And they found the stirrup pump as well that they'd used for the sulphuric acid. So that was pretty straightforward. The part, of course, that was not straightforward was how to deal with Hague's issue of insanity. In England, as I'm sure they do in America, we have the test then was known as the McNaughton rules, which said for insanity, criminal insanity, you had to find a disease of the mind that led to a defect of reason, which meant you couldn't tell right from wrong. Right from wrong in the legal sense, not the moral sense. And the problem here was the psychiatrist trying to find a disease of the mind, and all he could say was that Hague suffered from paranoia. I'm quite sure how he even came to that conclusion, but the psychiatrist couldn't say much about whether Hague knew right from wrong. Well, of course, I mean, I say of course, but I think the jury didn't need much convincing about whether he could tell right from wrong because he'd prepared everything so meticulously. But paranoia is not a disease of the mind in that sense. And I admire the judge here, who himself was 81 years old, was saying, look, I don't want an argument. I don't want to hear about whether this is a disease of the mind or not. Let's just say it was. I don't care. Say it was. You still got to decide, members of the jury, that Mr. Haigh couldn't distinguish right from wrong. Well, that didn't really hamper matters much because in the end, the jury only took 15 minutes to decide Hague was guilty and bring in a guilty verdict.
So Hague didn't just stop with confessing to these 5 murders. He added 3 more people to the list, and his memory was foggier about the details of these other murders. He couldn't remember names, dates, etc.
No, I think that was just Hague piling on the agony because the police could find no evidence of 3 other missing people. They looked at the missing persons list, etc., and I thought you can imagine Hague sitting there in his cell saying, well, I've told them about the blood, I've told them about this and that. Well, I think I'll add on a few victims. So, as you say, he mentioned another 3. I think he hardly knew their names. He was obviously making it all up. And he tried desperately to make it all sound convincing. But we didn't, the court didn't really need much more than present pretty horrific list of victims that they had already. As to the trial, I'll just say a word about that. I think this was an occasion that Hague really enjoyed. They say he sat there in the prisoner's dock, throughout the whole trial with the newspaper crossword on his knee and a pen, sort of thinking about that, not paying much attention to what was going on. I'm sure that was all faked to look mad and unconcerned. But he was represented by the most distinguished lawyers. He was prosecuting was an Attorney General, Sir Hartley Shawcross. These are not common, well-known names nowadays. And defending Hague was Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. But the interesting thing about these two characters was they'd both been involved in the Nuremberg trials after the war, trying the Nazis. So here was old Hague sitting there enjoying all this, knowing that these two men had been involved in the prosecution of Goebbels, Hess, and various other Nazi big names. And now they were turning their attention to Hague, so this all bolstered his confidence. The other thing he'd rather done, I think it just shows something about his ego, is that he'd taken his girlfriend, Barbara Stevens, a few days before the trial, but before he was arrested, to Madame Tussauds, which of course he insisted on, the infamous Chamber of Horrors there, took her down there. And he said to Barbara, Barbara, I wouldn't mind at all if I was here. She said, oh, John, don't say awful things like that. But you could see his mind was already working, that he knew probably what the inevitable was going to happen. And the idea of ending up in the Chamber of Horrors as one of Madame Tussauds' waxworks, I think rather thrilled him.
Yeah. Speaking of the Nuremberg trials, the common defense for Nazis who stood trial was that they were only following orders from a higher power. And that's the stance that Hague took as well. He argued that he was not bound by the common laws of the unwashed masses, right? He said he took his orders directly from God.
Absolutely. We haven't mentioned much about Hague's background, but I'm sure you're absolutely right. He grew up in a Plymouth Brethren household in northern England, and they were very strict Plymouth Brethren. The only book in the household was the Bible, and there was a 10-foot-high fence surrounding the house. They didn't allow him to bring his little school friends back. So this man was just brought up in isolation. They doted her, they loved him, and I think he probably loved them too. But the only thing they did allow Hague to do is he managed to get a choral scholarship to the local cathedral, Wakefield Cathedral, where he sang in the choir. He was obviously very musical. As I said, he played the piano beautifully. And in some ways, that was surprising that they let him out there, because that was occupied most of his Sundays, early service at the cathedral in the choir. I think there were 4 services during the day, which Hague went to. But that certainly gave him a bit of an eye on the outside world. So he certainly wasn't naive in that sense. But once back home, very, very isolated. But his parents stuck with him to the end. And even when they heard about his trial and the verdict, they said, we still love you, we still back you, you'll always be the first thing in our hearts. But you're quite right, Eric. I don't know how much of this, again, was put on by Haigh, because as the judge said afterwards, you can't trust what this man says at all. But he said his life was ruled by God, that God had preordained that if I was preordained, said John, to murder all these people, then it happened. All I could do is sort of sit there, stand back as a spectator. There may be an element of truth in this, because Haigh just seemed so aloof all his life, so unconcerned with no empathy for his clients or anybody else. So, for his victims, he could become close friends with them. I think there is another element here while we're thinking about Haig's personal life, and I think the chances were that he was homosexual. And the reason I say that is that his first victim, to whom he was very close, Donald McSwan, was homosexual and lived in a house with two other homosexuals who'd received court convictions for this. And so that was the sort of background. And in fact, Haig lived with Donald McSwan for a time just up the road from the hotel until they were bombed out during the war. And I think at that point, Haig went into the hotel, and I think Donald McSwan went back to his parents in Pimlico, London. But I don't know if this explains anything or not, but Haig led a secret life. And it emerged that, in fact, after 5 years with Barbara Stevens, this very attractive girlfriend he had, there had been no sexual relationship between them at all. And she said, I imagine John was waiting, as it were, till I was 21, and then I hoped it would be marriage. I mean, she loved him. And, of course, that was not to be. And she even went to visit him several times in prison after his conviction and stuck by him and was devastated by what had happened and couldn't really believe that this was the real John Haigh.
And it would be revealed that he had been married before to a woman named Beatrice Hamer. What is known about that relationship?
We know very little. We know that the marriage had been a complete failure, and I don't think they'd lasted together more than a year, possibly less. They're, again, unsubstantiated, but there was some talk about them having a child whom, if it was Haig's child, he had nothing to do with. He wasn't interested. And whether Beatrice had relationships with other men and had had a child, I don't think we know. But as you say, he was still married. He'd never gone through any form of divorce. And he'd always promised Barbara Stevens that, or she certainly imagined that once she became of age, as it were, 21 in those days, that he would get divorced and that he would marry her. But there was some, I don't think it's much more than, rumour that, in fact, he'd led, Haig had led quite a fast life in his youth, that he'd had girlfriends, but had reached some point in his life where, for some reason, he did a complete U-turn, decided women he didn't trust or like, and from then on had lived this bleak bachelorhood.
I want to ask you more about this vampire angle. Obviously, newspapers had fun with that. He claimed that he tapped the bodies like a keg, basically, and drank a glass of blood after each murder. And no glass stained with blood was ever found at the scene of Mrs. Durand-Deacon's murder. No evidence at all that it had ever happened, only his statement that he did it. He also told people he drank his own urine, and this is the kind of stuff that newspapers really had a field day with.
Sold a lot of newspapers. Of course, we couldn't prove it because we didn't have any bodies. So, if we could have had a body, we could have seen if there were incisions in the neck. I think it was probably just made up. He said he started seeing visions of Christ crucified on trees and dripping blood, all very fanciful. And that's exactly it. I think this was all made up, really, to sound pretty mad. But that side of it, they couldn't prove, and I doubt if the jury paid much attention to that.
In an exchange with a cellmate, while awaiting trial, I think, his cellmate was like, you got to commit to this thing a little harder. Just drinking a glass of blood doesn't cut it. You got to be acting like a vampire. You got to be jumping around in the rafters. And your urine drinking, you have to be more consistent with it. You have to do it more often.
Yes. I think he overcooked that, because I think that had come sort of... There's one thing about this, actually, that at his arrest, he never mentioned the drinking blood episode. So this all seems to have been cooked up, in the weeks after the arrest. It was pointed out in his trial, well, Mr. Haigh, you've come up with all these fanciful stories, but you didn't mention this at the time of your arrest. You mentioned all the victims and what have you. And I don't think there was... I don't think there was a quick answer to this. The urine seems to have appeared while he was in the condemned cell at Wandsworth Prison. So we should add that at the trial concluded by 15 minutes from the jury and everyone came back in, the judge donned his black cap, as we did in those days before capital punishment was stopped in England. It was actually more like a black cloth, and Haigh thought this extremely amusing and said to someone after the trial that the judge looked like a sheep looking out from under a rhubarb leaf. Well, I don't know if he found how funny he found it at the time, but that was rather sort of classic Haigh. So he's condemned to death. That was by hanging then, up to 1965 here. And he is transferred at that stage to Wandsworth Prison in London, to the condemned suite. A bleak room. They tried to make it reasonably comfortable in the sense that it had a window where you could see the trees beyond the prison walls. A table, 3 chairs for 2 police officers and the condemned prisoner, so they could sit around, drink tea and try to pass the time of day. 2 doors, one door not used, and the other door leading to a corridor with the bathroom in it, a lavatory and a bathroom and a shower. And that was it. Appeals to the Home Secretary, who was the government minister responsible for executions and domestic order. That was refused. Still trying the insanity ticket. And in fact, 3 psychiatrists, one from Head of Broadmoor, came up to look at him, and they thought on the whole that he wasn't, they didn't find he was insane. And so he was duly executed. Before we say a word about that, you may wonder how Haigh, who had no money, could afford all these expensive barristers. Well, what had happened is that, going back to your newspaper question, is that the News of the World newspaper, which is now defunct, had offered to pay for his defence and get the most expensive lawyers in return for getting his inside story. But that really was quite helpful, because the reporter who was put to this task acted as a go-between between Haigh in prison and his parents. And, it did help out a bit there. And in the end, it was decided the parents would not come down and visit him in the condemned cell. And one of the main reasons seems to be that our smart, urbane Haigh had to shift into prison clothes when he was condemned. And he didn't like that at all. He felt it was not. He didn't want his parents to see him in prison clothes, and told them not to bother, which is probably just as well. It must have been very upsetting. So that was that chapter closed. But Haigh, throughout these 3 weeks he was there in the condemned cell, which is the period they fix, was always in good humour. Saw Barbara a couple of times to say goodbye, and acted in a very straightforward way. But I think by this stage, I don't think he wanted to even appeal. his case, he realised his number was up. He'd had enough of it all. All he did do, going back to Madame Tussauds, because he was convinced to see this one through, was to say, look, Madame Tussauds can have my jacket, green jacket, and my green tie to put on the waxwork dummy of me in the Chamber of Horrors, which I would like to happen. And Madame Tussauds asked if they could come up on the afternoon before his execution to take a death mask moulding, which, of course, you probably remember they did in the French Revolution. Robespierre and co. ended up with death masks made by Madame Tussauds on the spot, I think, the real Madame Tussauds. And this, for Hague, this involved 3 hours lying on his back, not even able to smile. And this was the afternoon before the morning after. And apparently he did all that in good humour. And so they were able to use the mask and his clothes to reproduce him. I think he almost appeared next day. Of course, this was all huge news in the media. And I imagine, did Madame Tussauds no harm at all? The other slip, the major mistake, though, made by the newspapers was the Daily Mirror in this country, with these garish headlines about vampire sucks blood and vampire confesses to 5-6 murders or whatever it was, which, of course, is entirely inappropriate because I know America has slightly different laws about this, but in this country, you just can't make any prejudged statements at all. They don't really like, the courts don't really like you even putting photographs up of the accused in case it prejudices the jury. I think probably quite rightly too. In fact, I think it's the same in America. If you think lawyers feel their client has received too much adverse publicity, they move the site of the trial. I don't know how much you can do this in the States, but you can move it, out of London to Oxford or to York or something like this, where the locals may not be quite so aware of what's gone on. But in Haig's case, it was impossible because he was nationally known. But I think he was tried in the end down in Lewis Crown Court rather than the Old Bailey.
Hague at the end was worried that he had gained too much weight, and he was concerned that the gallows wouldn't work properly on the day of his execution, so he actually requested an execution dress rehearsal, right?
I think probably the first time, if not the last time, that was ever requested. I think probably the governor never knew what was quite coming next from Hague. Yes, he was very concerned that his executioner should have a good look at him to see what sort of weight he was, so he could judge the appropriate length of the rope when he was, for the drop, when he was finally executed. The procedure in this country at the time, in fact, was that was all cared for because the executioner, Pierpoint was his name, would have a look into the condemned cell the evening before the execution, through the spy hole, so the accused didn't know, the victim didn't know that was happening. To get an idea of the size, he'd know his weight, of course, so that was the important thing because he'd been weighed and measured, etc. And then the executioner with his assistant would go actually to the gallows, which are inside the prison, and get it all set up, work out the drop. They would actually do it with a sandbag just to see if everything, the machinery, as it were, was working properly. The reason he was there the evening before is that over the centuries, executioners have got a reputation for getting completely drunk by the time they actually came to hang the accused. And the authorities were getting pretty fed up with this and said, look, in future, you will come in with your assistant by whatever, 7 o'clock the previous evenings. You'll have dinner here. You'll have a look at the accused, and you will go to bed here in a well, I won't say a cell, but in a room in the prison, so that we don't have you drinking or whatever you want to do. And that was the accepted procedure then. But Pierpoint was very experienced and was our main executioner. In fact, going back to the our Nuremberg Nazi criminals, Pierpoint had executed most of them in that post-war period. He went over to Nuremberg and saw the execution through because, of course, hanging someone is technically quite a difficult thing to do. And again, I don't want to go into too many details, but the knot has to be put in the right place, and it has to be done quickly before the victim panics and starts making everything very difficult. Pierpoint was so experienced and so proud of his procedure that in Hague's instant itself, between going in to get Hague from the condemned cell, incidentally, he appeared through that second door I mentioned, which no one used. So I think it always takes the prisoner by surprise. He bound his hands behind his back, would then be marched through a short corridor to the scaffold, which was next door to the condemned cell, and then would be shown the chalk mark where he would have to stand. A white cotton hood was put on the head and the noose fixed around the neck. So you had to know exactly what you're doing. But Pierpoint, the hangman, said on this occasion, this took 11 seconds only to get from the condemned cell into the execution chamber and for the drop. Very, very quick. So the victim had little time really to think about all this, and on some occasions it was done even quicker.
Hague also confided to someone that he believed that being declared mad was a badge of honor. He thought history was filled with mad geniuses, and he believed himself to be intellectually superior to others, right?
Yes, I'm sure he did. He had a huge ego. I think I mentioned it in the book that he fancied himself solving world problems. That he wrote an address to the United Nations saying he'd found the answer to the world's problems. And it starts with a sort of wonderful cliche about, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking. It was really like a schoolboy would do. It's the kind of thing we did do at school. We wrote these sort of rather highfalutin speeches. Yes, a huge egomaniac, which in a frightening sort of way, Hague nearly got away with. Had he stopped these murders, let's say after the first 5, he would have got away with it. And I think Durand-Deacon was his big mistake. And the other mistake with her was, I'm not quite sure how he was going to become rich, because all her money was tied up in assets, not liquid assets, into fixed assets, into trusts, which I think her husband had laid out anticipating all this. So it wouldn't be just a matter of Hague setting to and transferring her property to him. It wasn't there. She was well off. She was well looked after from the income from the trusts, but I don't think she held the capital. What it did give him, in the sad way, is that he could sell her jewellery, of course, as we've discussed, for ready cash, which got him over another hurdle. But he would have had to start thinking quite quickly again, not like the others who had houses and property, real estate. He would have had to start thinking again quite quickly about what the next step was. I don't know if he'd chosen another victim from the hotel, but there we are. Just while we're talking about the hotel, I think the judge must have been paying very good attention to all. He was very quick. He was 81 years old, but he was very quick and admired by the barristers with his replies. He didn't miss a trick. But he didn't miss a trick about Hague's lifestyle, this rather comfortable hotel. They would have discussed what the rent was. that it was for retired people. How old was the judge? 81. When did he retire? 2 years later. Where did he go? He clocked into the same hotel. It sounded so tempting. And I amused to myself. I wonder if he even got Hague's room, or perhaps Mrs. Durand-Deacon's room 115, which was one of the best rooms in the house. He certainly could have afforded it. But it's a nice little epilogue to this rather sad saga that that's where our Judge Humphreys actually ended his day. I believe he lived another 4 years in there. It's a comfortable hotel. I've stayed there. That was sort of part of my research. And rather bizarrely, actually, I took my wife up there on one of our wedding anniversaries, and I asked for and got Hague's old room, which is, I think, on the 4th floor. I think it's 420. I can't remember. It's in the book. And I got it. A small room. And this is where he planned, certainly Durand-Deacon, and wrote these infamous shopping lists that we've still got, where he'd sort of put on a list, the sort of chit, we all write out at home, must go to cleaners, shopping, groceries, and then in the same list would be added industrial gloves, rubber apron, boots, acid, as if, this is the sort of thing you might pick up like your cornflakes. So it was a detached, odd sort of mind. You could say, in a way, couldn't you, that he was insane, not enough for the law, but his lack of empathy and sympathy and his immorality. He was amoral, and how much all this difference be made by his upbringing, it must have affected him. Although, as I said, his parents loved him and expressed their love for him, and he, in letters, right till his last day, wrote them very affectionate letters. So, a very complicated character.
Right, yeah. Goodness. Well, this has been so fascinating. I appreciate you sharing some of the details of this case with us. I do want to point out to listeners that you have a website and your books are available on Amazon.
Yeah, certainly on Amazon. They're a good price on that. It's a paperback, so it's not too expensive, Eric. I'd be very delighted if they'd like, without wanting to push it. But we managed to get a good bunch of photographs for the book too, and it brings a lot of these characters to life. There's one photograph I particularly treasure there, which is the cashier at the hotel, the manager of the hotel, and Constance Lane. You remember the old dear who went off to the police, and they're all arriving at court on the day of the trial. They all look like they're at some sort of office outing. They all got broad grins on their faces, and they look very happy. Look like they're in for adventure. But every picture tells a story, and it does put it puts most of these characters in context.
Yeah. So you've written a couple of other books, including one about an escape, a famous escape from Broadmoor. Would you mind giving us a little summary?
Yes, Broadmoor is an interesting place. It was built in Victorian days in about 1863, when Queen Victoria, as it were, was the height of her powers, and colonial Britain was expanding in every direction. We're becoming well off. And the Victorians, this is a contradiction in their character, but we think of them as rather aloof and very strict about morals and everything. But they certainly had a concern about people with mental problems. And we'd had a place called Bedlam. You may be aware with the expression, the whole place was Bedlam. Well, that was a abbreviated Bethlehem Hospital in London for the insane, but they were treated like zoo animals. They were put in cages, and people came out at weekends to look at them, and poke fun at them. And the Victorians said, well, this can't go on. We're going to build a vast hospital called Broadmoor for the criminally insane, and virtually you could only get in there if you committed murder and were found insane at the same time. The Victorian buildings are still there. It's moving slightly next door into modern premises at last. But a lot of our very famous criminals have ended up there. I have written a book about it called Escape from Broadmoor, and it's about, for me, a local character called John Straffen, who lives where I do in Bath in the West Country, who committed a couple of murders in the city and was then arrested and was sent to Broadmoor as being insane. They thought he was too insane to stand trial. But then after a few months, 6 months only, he escaped, which was very unusual, and committed another murder straight away, almost confirming, they got it right the first time. But they decided, the courts in their wisdom decided that he wasn't in fact insane after all, and put him in a normal prison, where he stayed for the rest of his life for 57 years and became our longest serving prisoner. He's dead now, but he only died about 10 years ago or so. But he happened to be a local resident here, and that's what really started me writing, as I was trawling through stuff, as you do, and I remember Broadmoor had this list of their 10 most famous patients. So we had people like the Cray brothers and a few others who may be more localized. But halfway down there was John Straffen, and I thought, well, I've never heard of him. Who is he? So I looked him up, I Googled him, and found that he'd been a resident of Bath, and in fact only about half a mile away from where I live. And when I walk into Bath from my house, I pass where he committed his first murder and where he lived with his family. So, it was obviously a good subject to start with. And I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. I could do all the research locally. And certainly nothing had been written about him. We'd never heard anything through the media. So that was very enjoyable. Then came the acid bath murders and Hague. And then the third one that I've written is about a character known as the Black Panther, who committed a kidnap and sadly, in the end, the death of a young girl aged 17. But it was very prolonged with a long police investigation, and all ended badly, but was a fascinating story, and was young enough to an extent that the case was young enough for people to remember all the drama that passed that. So that is 3 books, and they follow a similar lines of the acid bath murders, and they've been fascinating to investigate. I'm sure, like America, we do have excellent central national archives here in South London, where you can actually find accounts of these trials, indeed actually using counsel's papers. I don't know if it was in John Haig's case. It could have been. Again, macabre, but we actually had a note from Pierpoint, the executioner, written out in his writing of how long the drop was to be. So he'd gone in the previous evening, he'd made this sort of note, and I remember it very clearly. He'd written this in large, bold, red crayon on a piece of paper. I think it was something like 7 feet 2 inches, which presumably he carried with himself to the gallows and made sure that was all set up properly. But these are some of the things you can produce if when you do the research. What I've always enjoyed about true crime is that it is true. And you're often discussing with people like yourselves, you come to a point and they say, oh my God, this actually happened, didn't it? It's not like reading some complicated mystery or criminal novel with a sort of clever ending that you didn't guess happened. A lot of it you could guess, but makes it much more interesting because you've got real characters here who actually lived and committed these terrible crimes, but had a character of their own, and very often were loved by their family and, had begun with normal lives. Strafford's case, for example, was local here in Bath, but he was educationally backward, had a low IQ, but did his best to get jobs, but of course he was always so slow, and there were obviously faults in his character. We've discussed Hague with that very strange beginning, and Donald Neilson, the Black Panther, all of which were strange people in their way, but with a mixture of normal. I think it's like anyone who entrusts us, often as movie stars or pop stars or business people. They have a talent, maybe a negative talent in some cases, but the rest of their character is almost like you and me. They go to school, they try to get jobs, sometimes they fail, their love relationships, complicated love life. And I think this, as true character, I think that's what makes them interesting. If I could add there, Eric, if I may, if any of our listeners would like any more information, I do have a website which you may want to produce separately with a copy of the front of the book, but it's Gordon Lowe, it's Lowe, author, gordonloweauthor.co.uk. And there is some more information about the books I've been talking about and a couple of vague photographs. But I would, of course, be pleased if you visited that. And if you have any further inquiries, indeed, about what we've been talking about now, and John Haigh, it gives a website there. I'd be only too pleased to answer any queries.
Well, thank you again for your time.
I appreciate yours, Eric.
Again, I have been speaking to Gordon Lowe, author of The Acid Bath Murders, The Trials and Liquidations of John George Haigh. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.